And now the next session is something I'm really proud about for BOFREC. This is something special. I think there are not that many work packages in previous Horizon 2020 projects that deal with societal perception and ethics. So I'm particularly proud that we have this work package and our contributions here in the next session. So the floor is yours.
Krista, thank you very much. And yes, it is special to a certain extent. It's not completely unique, but I think what made it within the BOFREC project unique is that if you start to discuss on genomic selection, it's not immediately something where people have ideas about what type of ethical issues it raises. So if you start to discuss cloning or GM, you have immediately red flags. And the interesting thing is with genomic selection, it's not like that. And you could say, well, that makes life much easier, so we can continue. And I think that's also a bold step made by Krista and others at the start to say, well, even if we do not have the red flags from the start, we think it is important to include the ethical and societal aspects. We have two presentations, one by Koen Kramer, from Utrecht University, colleague in my team, who will tell a bit about how we discussed and analyzed the ethical issues in the context of BOFREC, and then followed by Donald Bruce. And he is the person behind one of the most, I think, visible deliverables of this project, and it's a game. And I won't say anything about it yet because Donald can say much more. Koen.
Yes, thanks, Frank, for that nice introduction. Yes, so I am Koen Kramer, indeed, and I did work in the work package on ethics, and I'm going to tell you a bit of what we've done in our work package. How does this work? Is this supposed to? Green, right, yes, okay. So the first question I asked myself starting working on this work package was why do we need to have an ethical discussion about breeding in the first place? So as Frank already mentioned, there are some other breeding technologies which are much more controversial, like cloning, like genome editing, but why should we have any kind of ethical discussion about breeding? And this was a question that kept on recurring throughout the project, and which came to have a clearer answer gradually, I would say. And I think the answer consists of a couple of steps, the answer that we came up with in the end. So first one thing to note is that breeding is presented as a potential solution to societal problems. So the European Forum for Animal Breeders connected animal breeding to the Sustainable Development Goals and claims that breeding can contribute to most of these, to 12 out of 17 of these goals. And although not all of these goals will be reached simply by means of the kind of animal we breed, but also by the institution more generally, there is a connection between at least some of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we breed and what kind of animals we breed. That is, at least, is the claim. Then a second point that relates to ethical issues is that breeding has been proposed as a potential solution to ethical problems within animal agriculture. There are issues around diseases, health problems, welfare problems, where it's been suggested, hey, maybe we can and should use breeding in response to these ethical issues, and in that way breeding can be a potential ethical solution. At the same time, and that is maybe part of the other side of the story, so at least some technologies that could be applied to advance these breeding goals, even if we say that these sort of good goals, are socially and ethically controversial. So we already mentioned cloning, more traditional genetic engineering, and genome editing. And so this raises the question, so should we use these more controversial technologies for goals that we consider socially and ethically desirable, or shouldn't we? But then, as Frank also already alluded to, a clear observation is that actually the way that breeding is professed and develops is often developments are much more gradual than that we're introducing this radical new technology which raises these radically new ethical issues, but more like small steps in terms of new phenotypic traits selected for different relative weight to different traits, new epigenetic markers or genetic markers, more of them, more or better statistical methods, more data. So much more like a gradual development from one situation to another than a giant leap towards another situation in breeding. So what does this mean then for how to do an ethics or an ethical analysis of breeding? So it's been suggested, at least, that, well, because these developments are so gradual, they aren't very interesting from an ethical perspective. So quotes like these may be heard. So genomic selection just exploits genetic variation and therefore isn't very interesting from an ethical perspective. Genome editing just speeds up breeding but isn't really new. Or from a publication by Lund and colleagues, the combined use of ovum pickup, in vitro embryo production, and genomic selection is ethically unproblematic because it is just a development from traditional breeding practices. So the suggestion in all these quotes is, well, only if there's something radically ethically new in how we breed is there an ethical issue to really be considered. And this is, this poses again the question, so how would we go about thinking about breeding and ethics? But here an important thing to consider is whether gradual developments can have significant implications. And it seems that sometimes they can. In many welfare problems, for example, the problem also developed gradually based on certain repeated decisions. So the decision to breed a chicken that was, well, probably too large for its own good, wasn't made overnight either, but was a succession of decisions, a succession of breeding choices that led to welfare problems. And so this suggests that sometimes we need to take into account not what radically new ethical problems a single step will introduce, but how ethical issues can arise over the course of many decisions. This may not only be true for welfare issues, but also some other issues. So, for example, the intensification of the use of advanced breeding techniques, where you might say, well, maybe adding one more breeding technique within this entire scheme of breeding techniques isn't very new, because we are already breeding animals by means of all kinds of laboratory techniques. So what's new here? But again, maybe it is not a single decision, but the entirety or the collection of these decisions which raises some ethical issues to be considered. And even if you say, well, there's nothing really new, so there's not a real issue, then you're presupposing that what we have been doing in breeding has been uncontroversial, which may not be true. So some studies have shown, for example, that the use of advanced reproduction techniques is perceived negatively by the general public. So a survey among the German general public shows that, well, this is probably illegible to you, that embryo transfer, for example, is rejected by a majority of respondents, and sex selection, also hormone treatment. So it's not clear that what has been going on within breeding is socially uncontroversial. Well, there are some other studies showing somewhat different figures. Maybe it's not a majority, maybe it's a sizable minority, but the idea is the same. Even if it's a minority, it's still not uncontroversial if the minority is large enough. So a more qualitative study by Knapp and colleagues showed that focus group participants were critical of applications of genomic selection, even though we've been using that for quite a while now, but applications that do not serve animal welfare, or that change animal species-specific characteristics, or that adapt to animals to undesirable production practices were controversial to these focus group participants. So what we think needs to be done is to have a broader discussion then about breeding. A lot of the issues that we just raised aren't discussed very often. So we think that it's important to broaden the societal and ethical discussion about breeding. So this includes 3 steps or 3 senses in which the discussion can be broadened. So first, we think it's important to not just discuss the hot innovations. So let's not only focus on genome editing and leave all the other discussions behind because we think they're not interesting, but also discuss like these more gradual developments that may have an impact over a long term, even though it's less clearly noticeable that there's something new going on. So the second sense in which these discussions need to be broadened, in our view, is that they need to cover a broad variety of ethical perspectives, including approaches for like evaluating these more gradual developments. So how can that be achieved? And third, that a broad range of publics need to be included. So it's often not very much on the public agenda, breeding as such, but as we saw with these surveys, for example, when people are asked and informed about them, they may still raise ethical questions. So what did we do? Oh, this went wrong with in terms of the format. What we did within the project was first write a report on the societal context of innovations in cattle genomics, including the more political issues. Then a report on ethical dimensions of livestock genomics. And finally, after an intermediate article, we devised an ethical framework that was meant to enable professionals, but not only professionals, to have ethical discussions about breeding technologies. So I'd like to focus now on this final part, the ethical framework or tool that we have developed. The idea is that it's a help to structure ethical discussions about breeding that consists of 3 parts. So the first part is to determine the scope of the discussion by means of a couple of questions. So which innovation or practices are we going to discuss? Are we going to discuss these from a realistic version where we're saying, well, we could make this improvement on a relatively short term and it's not practically very much of a problem, or are we going more looking for an ideal vision for breeding, where we say, well, this is the dot on the horizon that breeding should be aiming at. Which alternatives deserve to be discussed? Should we focus on the new ethical issues or also discuss the existing ones? Well, as I already said, we think it's important to often also include the ethical issues that are pre-existing an innovation. Then in the second part, the tool consists in answering a couple of questions related to these ethical concepts. Again, this may not be very well legible to you, but we have identified ethical perspectives related to animal interests, human-animal relations, interhuman concerns, human interests, and environmental issues. Connected these to a couple of to a number of ethical concepts, and related these to explicit questions to be answered during an ethical discussion. Yeah, I'm wrapping up. Yeah, great. And then in the final part, the tool offers a number of approaches for, well, after you have answered all these questions and clarified your ethical considerations, how do you translate them into a decision? And the tool offers a number of options for doing that. So that is, I suppose, the most practical, useful result from at least our part of the work package, although Donald will in a moment tell you about the Demox game as another practical application. So that was what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.